We begin our journey here, in an isolated and vulnerable world of extremes. In many ways, this is the perfect place to investigate the future health of our planet. A future conditional on how we cope with the spread of toxic pollution. The Arctic is a place dominated by the rhythms of nature and the seasonal patterns of migration. It's a place of deep fjords teeming with life, and remote fishing villages governed by the endless cycle of strong tidal currents. Ehalawit is a remote village in northeastern Canada, about 90 miles south of the Arctic Circle. Most of the 5,000 people who live here are Inuit, a nomadic people that migrated across a land bridge from Asia more than 4,000 years ago. Though this is a community that has clearly entered the 21st century, rush hour traffic has never really been an issue. In fact, Ihalawit has less than 10 miles of roads. The only way in or out of town is by plane or boat. Ihalawit is surrounded by a long arm of the North Atlantic and treeless green carpets of tundra, covered with the delicate flowers of summer. However, the image that most people have of the polar region, of a pristine, unspoiled wilderness, is far from accurate. The Arctic, which has very few sources of industrial pollution, is turning into a toxic sink. 500 miles south of Ihalawit is a small settlement of only 600 people. Yet it's the home of the region's first trace metal analytical laboratory. This is where biologists, using highly sophisticated instruments, study nearly 1,000 animal specimens each year. Incredibly, they show rising levels of the world's most hazardous chemicals: DDT, PCBs, dioxins, and mercury. Michael Kwan is the lab's chief toxicologist.
Mercury levels in the Arctic environment in general is increasing, and so it is very important for us to closely monitor anything that people eat: fish, marine mammals, caribou, anything that's consumed by local Inuits.
But where do these chemicals come from, and how did they get here? In a phenomenon scientists call the grasshopper effect, toxic pollutants released thousands of miles to the south evaporate in the warm climate, then ride the winds until they reach the cold air of the Arctic, where they eventually fall to the earth. It doesn't take long for the caribou to feed upon the tainted moss and shrubs of the tundra. And in the sea, fish feed upon toxic plankton, which are then eaten by seals and polar bears.
Polar bears are showing up with levels in their fat of certain toxic pollutants that would qualify them for burial in a hazardous waste site. Now, those polar bears don't work in factories, but what they do is they're at the top of the food chain, right now full of a lot of hazardous materials. This is clearly a cause for concern.
Polar bears are not the only ones at the top of the food chain. Barney Kovic and his 13-year-old nephew Virgil are hunting seal. They will be on the water for about 12 hours. The sea ice is not completely broken up, so the boat must maneuver slowly through dangerous waters. Barney and Virgil are searching for ringed seals, one of the most abundant sea mammals in the polar region. Here in the Arctic, hunting is far more than a sport. It's a necessity because the meat provides as much as 65% of the protein in the Inuit diet, and most families simply can't afford the high cost of store-bought food.
Seal hunting is absolutely important in order to nourish us and to give us the food that we require. But the process of the hunt is very powerful, and that is something that most people have not come to understand. The hunt itself and the process of it teaches us such wisdom to be able to go out there and build character for our children. We have done so for millennia.
It was only 50 years ago that the Inuit followed a more nomadic existence. Life was never easy for those who braved the harsh polar climate. The Inuits' never-ending pursuit of food was a matter of survival. For thousands of years, the sea was the Inuits' greatest source of sustenance. And seal hunting was an essential part of their culture. The hunt was also a learning experience, a skill handed down from generation to generation. Barney and Virgil had been out for almost 7 hours. They finally spot a ringed seal. The first shot misses. The seal dives, but Barney knows it can only stay underwater for a few minutes before coming up for air. He now has to anticipate where the seal will rise and hope that it's within range. When the seal appears, Barney signals for the boat to maneuver closer. His patience is finally rewarded. This one seal will feed Barney's extended family for a week. But recent studies show that Inuits have some of the world's highest levels of toxic chemicals in their bodies.
It was really shocking when the science started to come in. The food that has nourished us for millennia, spiritually, emotionally, and physically, were now poisoning us, and it was not of our doing.
The discovery of toxic pollutants in the food supply has put 155,000 Inuits on the brink of a public health disaster.
The women who eat these animals themselves then are absorbing these industrial pollutants that were originally used in the United States, Mexico, Central America, and China. And as they travel into the bodies of these women, they're deposited in fat. And when they have babies, the fat releases right into the breast milk. They have to feed their babies. They don't have access to formula. And as a result, the breast milk that they are giving their babies, a source of life and sustenance, is contaminated with some of the worst pollution we have ever seen on this planet.
I think the world has to care about what's happening up here in the Arctic because we have become the early warning system. Whatever happens to the planet happens first here in the Arctic. And I think that's what the world has to understand.
For now, the Inuit, who have contributed almost nothing to the contamination of their land, remain unintentional victims. Their only hope is that communities to the south find ways to halt the spread of toxic pollution. As we will learn, that's not an easy task. – 4,000 miles from the Arctic, November 2nd is known as the Day of the Dead. This is Mexico's most important and festive holiday. Here in Tijuana, Families are joining together at the graves of their closest relatives to honor and celebrate their memories. It is believed that the souls of children will be the first to be saved. Food and gifts appropriate for their age decorate their grave sites. Unfortunately, there are too many graves of young people in Tijuana. Not far from the center of town, along the border with the United States, is a tariff-free industrial trade zone.
As a result of the border industrialization program that the U.S. and Mexico signed, as well as the North American Free Trade Agreement, we have here over 300 maquiladoras, foreign-owned companies that operate in this industrial park behind me.
Thanks to NAFTA, these factories provide nearly 140,000 jobs for the people of Tijuana. But at what cost?
This site is Metales y Derivados, a highly toxic site abandoned by a U.S. company. The people who live around here in this valley below, they live with a constant exposure to the toxics that come out of these maquiladoras.
In 1994, the Mexican government cited this American-owned battery recycling plant for failing to dispose of hazardous waste. In response, the owner abandoned the location. When threatened with arrest unless he cleaned up the site, he fled across the border to San Diego. Left behind were over 46 million pounds of toxic waste, baking in the sun. It's been poisoning the soil and the air for more than a decade. In a valley just below the industrial park is Colonia Chilpancingo, a community of about 10,000. When it rains, a nearby creek is flooded with chemical wastes from the industrial park. They include lead oxides, sulfites, heavy metals, sulfuric acid, and arsenic. As this highly contaminated waterway weaves its way through the shantytown community, it poisons everything and everyone in its path, including the community's only source of water.
The health problems that people suffer from are, many of them are related to contaminants in the water. We know they don't drink, but they can't help using to wash their clothes, to wash their dishes. So eventually some of it does get into their system. Kids who bathe in this water suffer from skin rashes and constant stomach problems.
Over 90% of the children of Colonia Chilpancingo tested positive for elevated levels of lead in their blood. An abnormally high number suffer from birth defects. For years, the community petitioned the Mexican government to clean up the site. Their pleas were always turned down. The $6 million needed to stop the pollution was never made available. And the children, whose toxic playgrounds are less than a mile from the United States, are the innocent victims of a trade agreement that has no provision to force compliance with environmental laws. Even worse, the parents of these children have few choices other than to labor in the same factories that are poisoning their kids. At the end of the day, thousands of workers head home. Though their jobs pay about $15 for a 10-hour day, they still cling to the dream of living in a healthier and better place. It's an optimism sparked by the recent success of a Latino community located just 17 miles away, in one of California's largest and most affluent cities. San Diego has always been known for its scenic waterfront. Its nearly perfect climate also makes it a popular sailing and tourist destination. But what tourists never see is a small neighborhood hidden away between the Coronado Bridge and a large waterfront industrial complex. Barrio Logan is 3 miles long and just 6 blocks wide. This is one of San Diego's poorest Mexican-American communities, and its residents have long been the targets of environmental discrimination. "40 years ago, the city of San Diego tried to force people out of Barrio Logan to make room for commercial development. Zoning laws were changed overnight. Small factories, junkyards, and auto wreckers were encouraged to move into the residential neighborhood. The community was outraged.
The pounding every day, smash, smash, smash. Our house is slowly cracking. The walls in our house, the paint peeling's falling off. This used to be a very nice area at one time until somehow somebody said it'd be a nice place to make junkyards.
Junkyards, industry, everything started happening. My community started kind of falling apart.
But most families were strongly attached to their neighborhood and refused to move. It didn't take long for city planners to try another tactic. They cut off Barrio Logan from the rest of San Diego by making it the site of an expanded highway system and a new bridge. Once again, the neighborhood was under attack. This time by enormous amounts of auto emissions. Salvador Torres, a local artist, remembers the community's frustration.
Here we are, we're faced with pollution of our community. The freeways coming through, the bridge. Suddenly industry starts developing here, and with this comes the idea of our community being assaulted with toxins.
Unable to stop the construction, anger surfaced. And when the city reneged on its promise to build a park under the bridge, the people of Barrio Logan demonstrated.
We shall continue to fight, my friend. We shall continue to live, my brother. We shall continue to fight, my friend.
They formed a human chain around the site and refused to leave until the city gave them their park.
It was the first time that we had all come together in a sense of unity for ourselves and our community. Other than that, it had been very isolated. We believed it, we said it, we taught our children, but we didn't vocally come out.
I think for the first time in my life, I saw some people that were very, you could see it in them, dedicated, committed, believing in something. We shall continue to live, my brother. We shall continue to fight, my friend.
After a 2-week standoff, the demonstrators won their recreational area, which they proudly called Chicano Park. Today, the pylons that support the bridge are covered with murals that celebrate Barrio Logan's Latino culture.
Chicano Park, to me, represents the struggle of our community. This idea was to develop monumental murals that would represent our history, that would represent the feelings that we have growing up in this community, our successes and our failures, our victories.
Though Barrio Logan won its battle for Chicano Park, it still struggles in its fight for clean air. Each day, hundreds of diesel trucks, nearly 300,000 cars, and dozens of factories operate in and around this residential neighborhood.
Studies have been done across the country showing that people of color in low-income communities are much more subject to being the targets of industrial sources moving into those neighborhoods than into other neighborhoods. This has resulted in a variety of health impacts. Approximately 20% of the children in Barrio Logan have either asthma or probable asthma.
The failing health of the children sparked a new community protest. This time, they went after Master Plating, a factory located in the residential heart of Barrio Logan that used hexavalent chromium, a known cancer-causing chemical.
Now, this is 10 News Nightcast.
Health officials have issued a stern warning.
Local television stations documented the community's fight.
Dangerous toxins are raising the risk of cancer for people who live in Barrio Logan.
You cannot see it, you can't smell it, but it can kill you. It's called hexavalent chromium.
The family that lives next door to Master Plating here in the 2100 block of Newton Avenue has a son who is forced to use an inhaler several times a day to alleviate severe breathing problems.
Common sense tells us that a plating shop does not belong next to a home or next to a school.
What we're trying to do now is to take the proper enforcement actions against the violator, which in this case is Master Plating.
The company blamed for causing the pollution is being shut down.
Master Plating is killing us. The refrain for a decade by residents of Barrio Logan.
I'm happy for my family, but mainly my community.
Because finally, after hundreds of meetings, scores of studies, dozens of protests, Master Plating is being shut down.
This is what good politics is. You know, community and our representatives, everybody. This is what it means to finally get something done, working together.
A few days after Master Plating closed down, the people of Barrio Logan gathered to celebrate the shutting down of a factory that had been poisoning their community for decades.
The celebration is to mark the closing of Master Plating and the reduction in toxic emissions from that facility. We're happy to report that there will be a 75% decrease in chrome levels at the houses around Master Plating, and that results in a much less of a cancer risk to residents in this immediate area.
For the people of Barrio Logan, this victory is one more milestone in their struggle for environmental justice. Their struggle against discriminatory zoning regulations, and their struggle to create Chicano Park. Barrio Logan's achievements may also serve as a wake-up call for a desert resort community located less than 150 miles away. On most Thursday afternoons, thousands crowd the streets of Palm Springs' weekly outdoor market. It's hard to believe that this city of 40,000 has anything in common with the Latino communities along the border or the Inuit villages in the Arctic. This is a place where children do not suffer from the effects of industrial pollution or a contaminated food chain. Yet within a few years, Palm Springs may be at the center of a serious public health emergency. 40 miles to the south, and rising out of a harsh brown landscape, is a vast body of water called the Salton Sea. It seems almost too good to be true. An inland lake in the middle of the desert. This is California's crown jewel of biodiversity, a sanctuary for millions of migrating waterfowl.
The Salton Sea is host to more species of birds than any other place, save perhaps for the Gulf Coast of Texas. Half of all bird species found in the United States can be found at the Salton Sea. So it's this massive truck stop, we like to say, a key location for birds to stop, eat, rest along their trip either north and south along this Pacific Flyway.
But as recently as 100 years ago, there was no water here. It was a huge, dried-out salt basin. The remains of ancient lakes that over time evaporated into the desert air. But in 1905, everything changed. That's when violent winter storms caused the Colorado River to go on a rampage. In the spring, the swollen river suddenly jumped its banks. The entire flow of the Colorado surged into the Salton Basin. Farmland and homes were washed away. For 18 months, engineers waged a fierce battle. When the river returned to its original course, what was left behind was the Salton Sea. Today, this is the largest inland body of water in California. For 4 months, temperatures soar over 100 degrees. Over 6 feet of water is lost to evaporation every year. But unlike the lakes of ancient times, it hasn't dried up.
This Salton Sea is very different than those previous Salton Seas. It's not this great lake that becomes massive and dries up and massive and dries up. It's a lake that's largely sustained by man's activities, particularly agriculture.
500,000 acres of rich farmland carpet the neighboring Imperial and Coachella valleys. Once a desert wasteland, today these farms provide nearly 85% of the nation's winter vegetable crop. What makes this billion-dollar industry possible is Colorado River water. Enough water to satisfy the yearly needs of a city of 24 million. But intensive irrigation also produces massive amounts of runoff.
The drain water that comes off of our fields and the fields in Coachella flow naturally into the Salton Sea, and there's pretty close to 1 million acre-feet of water that runs into the Salton Sea every year. There's no flow out of it, so anything that flows into there stays there.
An enhanced satellite photograph shows a landlocked Salton Sea. Surrounded by mountains and desert, the green areas to the north and south are irrigated agricultural development. These farms are the source of drain water that keeps the sea from drying up. But it's a resource that presents a major paradox. What feeds the Salton Sea is slowly killing it. The agricultural drain water contains enormous amounts of salt and chemicals. Over the years, it has become 25% saltier than the ocean. Several decades ago, the sea's ecosystem began to suffer. In the 1980s, outbreaks of botulism and algae blooms killed millions of fish. And then the birds began to die. Today, the shoreline often serves as a graveyard for thousands of waterfowl. In one 3-month period, 150,000 eared grebes died. Though the exact cause remains unknown, most scientists believe the dead birds fed on tainted fish. What is known is that the die-offs changed the public's perception of the sea.
The Salton Sea is a maligned resource in many ways because it's been discarded. It was well used in the 1960s as folks came out here, built marinas and developments around the shoreline, used the Salton Sea to fish and to boat and water ski. That heyday is now gone. If you go around the Salton Sea today, you see the remnants of the 1960s and the early 1970s. Those marinas and hotels are gone now and dilapidated now. And we don't have the visitation that we once did for all sorts of factors. One of them is folks' fear.
Today, the biggest fear is that if the sea gets saltier, it won't be able to support any life. Robert Schrag from the California State Wildlife and Game Service is monitoring the fishery.
Right now we're out gill netting, trying to find important information regarding age, size, weight, reproductive status. It's what we need to know to find out what's going on with the fish populations. Worst case scenario of the sea is it remains on the way it's going and basically becomes too salty to handle the fish so that they can reproduce. And if that happens, we're going to lose some of the fish-eating birds, actually most of the fish-eating birds. It's an important part of the ecosystem here.
Though recent tests indicate the salinity of the sea is still low enough for fish to reproduce, there exists another serious threat, and it's all about who owns the rights to Colorado River water. Released on demand from the Hoover Dam, the water that sustains the Salton Basin travels 1,400 miles. Just before the river crosses into Mexico, much of its volume is diverted into a series of canals, eventually bringing life to the farms of the Imperial and Coachella valleys. Today, these farms consume half of California's share of Colorado River water, more than Los Angeles and San Diego combined. This has long been the focus of legal battles with the water-starved communities of Southern California.
In the West, for you to establish a right to water, you have to get to it and use it. The environment, unfortunately, doesn't have as much standing as farmers and cities and the like, particularly along the Colorado River.
In an historic agreement, farmers have agreed to sell to San Diego County enough water to satisfy the needs of 2 million people each year. But this has also trapped the Salton Sea between the needs of its fragile ecosystem and the conflicting interests of farmers and developers.
For every drop of water being moved to the urban California coast, to San Diego, that means 1 drop less of water flowing into the Salton Sea.
Keeping the Salton Sea alive isn't necessary for us to keep farming, and in some ways it's almost detrimental, because if the Salton Sea is to be mandated to stay alive, then we have to be careful of the quality of our drain water that goes off there. And from a farming standpoint, we look at it as an agricultural sump to which it was designated.
If those flows stop coming to the Salton Sea, we'll see an immediate decline in the fishery and an immediate decline in the health of the Salton Sea and our ability to sustain the environmental bounty that we currently sustain.
One of the things that I'm concerned about with the Salton Sea is that as the flows into the sea are reduced, the sea will get smaller. And as the sea gets smaller, lake bed will be exposed. Estimates are somewhere between 70 and 100 square miles of lake bed won't be covered with water anymore.
What exactly are the consequences of an inland sea drying up? Should the people living near the Salton Sea be concerned? And what can we learn from an event that happened 7,000 miles and a world away from California? Here, in a remote corner of Uzbekistan, in Central Asia, the nearest body of water is almost 90 miles away. Yet, in this seemingly uninhabited wilderness, there exists an extraordinary sight. a vast graveyard of boats in the middle of the desert. These are the abandoned skeletons of a once proud and prosperous fishing fleet. Today, the ruins are a reminder that 40 years ago, these sand dunes were covered by an ocean of fresh water. How could this happen? How could the world's fourth largest inland body of water, the Aral Sea, become the site of what the United Nations calls man's greatest ecological disaster? And what does this tell us about the future of the Salton Sea? Our story begins in the ancient city of Samarkand. The early morning hours could be a scene out of Marco Polo's journal. It seems like a moment suspended in time. A reflection of the ethnic sweep of Central Asian history. The conquests of Alexander the Great and Genghis Khan. These are the descendants of nomads who lived 2,500 years ago, when Samarkand was at the crossroads of the greatest trade route in history, the legendary Silk Road. Desert caravans connecting China and Rome brought with them not only an exchange of goods, but new ideas, new cultures, new religions. Though the Silk Road traders and marauders are long gone, their spiritual and cultural legacies remain. The heart and soul of Samarkand is a medieval complex, a center of religious scholarship. Restored to its original splendor, it's an architectural wonder of the Islamic world. And beyond these walls is a country and a people surrounded by ancient history. A people caught between their Silk Road heritage and the pressures of the 21st century. Tashkent is Uzbekistan's capital. Home to nearly 3 million people, this is Central Asia's most modern city. Once at the crossroads of the ancient trade routes, unlike Samarkand, much of its history has been paved over. Tashkent's wide avenues are a gift from the country's most recent conqueror, the Soviet Union. Though the Soviets have been gone since 1991, they left behind yet another legacy. A legacy based on their demand that Uzbekistan become a major producer of cotton. In the early 1960s, engineers from the Soviet Union devised an ambitious program. They decided to reshape the desert, to turn sand into cotton, to help save the Soviets' failing economy. Tens of thousands of workers built a vast network of irrigation canals covering 100,000 square miles. Water laced with fertilizers and pesticides was pumped onto the land. Within a decade, Uzbekistan became the world's second largest producer of cotton. But that was when the country's largest river, the Amu Darya, was an untapped source of water. It was a river so wide, it took Alexander the Great's army 5 days to cross it. Today, the lower Amu Darya has been sucked dry by upstream cotton farms. Huge pumps that once diverted water for irrigation are idle. Dried-out canals scarred the landscape. Deprived of water, river traffic is non-existent. Abandoned cargo boats litter the shoreline. Mute testimony to a misguided agricultural policy. And a river, once wider than the Mississippi, never reaches its natural destination, the Aral Sea. Computer images based on satellite data document the event. As an expanding cotton industry consumed almost all the water flowing into the Aral Sea, it began to shrink. In just over 3 decades, an ancient and thriving ecosystem was half its original size. Before the collapse of the Aral Sea, a fleet of Soviet trawlers worked these rich waters. They were joined by fishermen from all over Central Asia. Each year, they brought in over 50,000 tons of fish. Every day, hundreds of boats pulled into Moynyak, Uzbekistan's largest port. Their holds filled with over 20 different species of fish. Conveyor belts carried their cargo directly into dockside processing plants. At its peak, the canneries produced over 12 million tins of fish a year and employed 3,000 people. Moynyak's population grew to over 40,000. But in the end, they lost everything. Today, Moynyak is a virtual ghost town, now 90 miles from the receding shores of a barren, lifeless sea. For those that stayed behind, there's very little to do. They are part of the Karakalpak population, a proud people with their own ethnic traditions, language, and culture. But with the destruction of the ecosystem, their very existence is under attack.
Moynyak, the city that's been most affected by the Aral Sea crisis, has never been an easy place to live. The attachment to the land is very strong. This is their homeland. The Karakalpak people have been here. This is their identity, this land. And for them to try to move now, to find another place is not easy.
Not very far from Moynyak, Guldasbey Juma Muratov and his family are gathering cotton. Once this was a season of great promise. Today, sources of water are drying up, and what's available is too salty and tainted with chemicals. Guldasbey has worked his ancestral farm all his life. When he was the age of his grandchildren, this small farm would yield 4 tons of cotton. Now they are lucky to gather half that amount. The family has no other choice than to struggle on or to join the hundreds of thousands who have moved to the shanty towns that surround the Aral Sea. Nearly all are Karakalpak settlements that have little infrastructure, with no running water, sanitation, or healthcare facilities. Of the 3 million people living near the Aral Sea, over 40% are unemployed. Everyone is an environmental refugee, fleeing from the destruction of an inland ocean. But all they found were poverty and disease. The region has one of the highest rates of tuberculosis in the world.
It's certainly well known that tuberculosis is a disease of the poor. TB bacilli is present in, some say, up to a third of the world population. But people don't get sick from TB all over the world. It's places where people are challenged by their environment or by their social conditions.
Tuberculosis is a disease that preys upon the weak and malnourished. It doesn't discriminate between age or sex. In recent years, drug-resistant strains of TB have developed. Difficult to treat effectively for the former fishermen, canners, and cotton farmers of Moignac. The prognosis is not very hopeful. However, tuberculosis is not the only health problem spawned by the collapse of the Aral Sea. Every year, windstorms sweep across the exposed seabed, picking up millions of tons of toxic salt and the residue of agricultural chemicals, including DDT. This legacy of the cotton industry has left behind the planet's highest concentration of airborne pollutants. Villages are covered with lethal dust. Surface water and communal wells are contaminated. The most seriously affected are women and young children.
Uzbekistan faces a tragedy of enormous proportion. The mothers and fathers who will create children in Uzbekistan themselves have bodies that have heavy levels of certain metals and pollutants that we understand have an effect on their capacity to become parents, as well as influencing the health of the children that they may produce.
Dr. Oral Ataniyazova is the director of the Center for Human Reproduction and Family Planning. She and her staff are trying to cope with an unprecedented environmental crisis.
The Aral Sea crisis is, I think it's not only environmental crisis, this is a big human crisis because we have now third generation of people who are living in such a polluted area.
25 years of contaminated water and air are taking a toll. 90% of pregnant women suffer from anemia. Not unlike the Inuit of the Arctic, their breast milk contains high levels of agricultural chemicals. The effect on infants is devastating. 5% of newborns have birth defects. 10% will die before their first birthday.
I think the Aral Sea crisis is one of the dramatic example on what could be happen if the environment and the irrigation system is mismanaged.
And for the people of Uzbekistan, the death of the Aral Sea has become a never-ending nightmare. Not far from Moignac are the ruins of a Silk Road city. A nearby cemetery dates back to the time of Genghis Khan. This particular mausoleum is considered by the Karakalpak people to be a holy shrine. Along these medieval walls are groups of 7 stones piled on top of each other. Placed there by an occasional and hopeful visitor, it is said that when each stone falls, a wish is granted. Here, in a remote corner of Central Asia, there are few hopes left. Though most scientists have concluded that it's too late to save the Aral Sea, it does serve as a graphic warning for the people of Palm Springs, who may live in the path of a potential storm of toxic dust. Not very far from the Salton Sea is a vast network of generators that harness the power of the wind, providing enough electricity for the entire Coachella Valley. They also serve as a reminder that high winds are a natural part of the local environment. As the Salton Sea begins to recede, toxic dust storms will inevitably come off the dried-out lake bed. Despite this danger, the transfer of water to San Diego has gone forward without an agreed-upon plan or even adequate funds to remedy the situation.
The Salton Sea, while it's California's largest lake, it's in this corner of California that people don't pay a lot of attention to. Unfortunately, those folks that don't pay a lot of attention to it today may have to in the future. As the sea recedes and we have these environmental problems, increasingly that's going to directly affect their lives. And they may not be concerned about the 400 species of birds here. They may not be concerned about the prolific fishery. But when the Salton Sea starts affecting human health in the Coachella and Imperial Valleys, they'd better care.
Though there are no easy answers or quick solutions to severe environmental problems, we now know that it's necessary to strike a balance between economic development and what nature can safely provide.
We know that children who are born into poverty lack good nutrition, lack access to health care. And if in addition to those basic problems, they also are growing up in a more polluted environment, they're really at double jeopardy.
We also know that many communities are struggling with forces well beyond their control.
Because we are a people that live on the ice and snow, we witness the most minute of changes to the environment. And so we are the canary in the mine, so to speak. And it's very important, I think, that the world pay heed to this.
Though separated by distance and culture, in the end, the health of those living in places like the Arctic and Barrio Logan cannot be separated from those living in Colonia Chilpancingo, Uzbekistan, and Palm Springs. This new reality presents us with enormous challenges for the future. A future conditional on providing new ideas, new attitudes, new hope. Planet Earth, this is our home. This is where our journey of discovery must begin.